They were told that Americans would do unspeakable things to captured women, that death was preferable to surrender, that honor demanded they take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. But when 47 Japanese nurses and comfort station workers stood in the mud of Saipan in July 1944, staring at the American soldiers who had just pulled them from a cave, they discovered something their commanders never prepared them for. The enemy didn't look at them with hatred. The soldiers looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. And when the women began screaming, "Kill us now! Kill us now!" in broken English and desperate Japanese, the Americans did something that would shatter everything these women believed about the war, about their enemy, and about themselves. One woman, Nurse Reiko Yamada, clutched a grenade she'd been saving for this exact moment. Her hands trembled as she watched a young American soldier, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, slowly shake his head. He held up his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. Behind him, another soldier was unwrapping something. It took her a moment to recognize it through her terror. Chocolate. The American was unwrapping a chocolate bar. Not a weapon, not rope for binding prisoners. Chocolate. This is the story of what happened when everything you've been taught collides with an impossible reality. When the monsters turn out to be men. When the enemy's greatest weapon isn't violence, but something far more devastating. Kindness. If you appreciate these untold stories from World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These historical accounts deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us continue sharing them. The island of Saipan in the summer of 1944 was hell on earth. The once lush tropical paradise had been transformed into a landscape of scorched earth, shattered palm trees, and craters so deep they looked like wounds in the island itself. The air tasted of sulfur and smoke, mixed with the salt of the Pacific Ocean that surrounded this tiny piece of land that had become one of the most contested battlefields in the Pacific War. For 3 weeks, the battle had raged. American forces had landed on June 15th, and the Japanese defenders fought with a desperation that shocked even battle-hardened Marines. But by early July, it was over. The Japanese forces were broken, scattered, pushed to the northern cliffs of the island. And that's where the women were. They had spent the last 5 days in a cave system. 47 women ranging in age from 18 to 54. Most were nurses who had been stationed at the military hospital. 7 were comfort station workers. 3 were school teachers who had been on the island teaching children of Japanese settlers. 2 were radio operators. All of them were now hiding in the darkness, listening to the sounds of American boots above their heads, waiting for the inevitable. The cave was cramped and stank of fear sweat, unwashed, bodies, and the copper smell of blood from wounds that had gone untreated. They had no food left. The last of their water had been finished 2 days ago. Some of the women had drunk rainwater that collected in pools on the cave floor, despite knowing it might make them sick. Survival instinct competed with something else, something darker, the knowledge of what was supposed to come next. The moment the Americans found them began with sound, the rumble of engines first, different from Japanese vehicles. Then voices, calling out in English, the beam of flashlights cutting through the cave darkness like searchlights. Someone was shouting in Japanese, but the accent was wrong, American and awkward. "Come out! Safe! You safe!" Reiko felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Next to her, another nurse named Fumiko was crying silently, her whole body shaking. Across the cave, one of the comfort station workers had already pulled out a small knife. The message had been clear from their commanders: death before dishonor. Capture was not an option, especially not for women. The smell hit them when the first American appeared at the cave entrance. It was strange and foreign, a mixture of American cigarettes, which had a different scent than Japanese ones, and something else. Soap. Clean soap. After weeks of living in filth and fear, that smell of cleanliness was almost offensive. It represented a world they no longer belonged to, a world of normal life that had been destroyed. The light grew brighter. Then shapes, silhouettes of men with rifles. Big men, bigger than most Japanese soldiers. Their helmets looked different. Everything about them screamed other, screamed enemy, screamed danger. And yet they weren't shooting. Why weren't they shooting? The oldest nurse, Harumi, spoke first. She was 54, had been a nurse for 30 years, had seen things that would haunt anyone. Her voice was steady when she stood up in the cave and said in Japanese, "We are ready. Make it quick." She bowed, a formal gesture even in this moment. Behind her, the other women began to stand, arranging themselves in a line. If death was coming, they would face it with dignity. But Reiko couldn't move. The grenade felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for days. Pull the pin, count to 3. Let it end quickly. Take some of them with her if possible. That was what she had been told to do. That was her duty. But her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They just trembled against the cold metal. One of the younger women, barely 19, began to scream. "Kill us now! Kill us now!" She repeated it in English, the only phrase she'd learned specifically for this moment. Others joined in, a chorus of women begging for death, because death was known. Death was safe compared to what they'd been told would happen. The propaganda had been specific, detailed, horrifying. American soldiers would do terrible things to captured Japanese women, things worse than death. The American soldiers stood frozen. The young one at the front looked genuinely distressed. He kept saying something, the same words over and over. But Reiko couldn't understand. An older soldier pushed to the front, a sergeant based on his stripes. He held up both hands and said loudly, slowly, "No kill, no hurt. Safe. You safe now." His face was sunburned, his eyes tired, but there was no cruelty there, no hatred. Just exhaustion and something that looked almost like pity. That's when the young soldier held out the chocolate bar. He broke off a piece and put it in his own mouth, chewing, trying to show them it wasn't poisoned. Then he held out another piece, his hand shaking slightly. No one moved to take it. The tension in that cave was thick enough to cut. On one side, women prepared to die. On the other, men prepared to save them. And neither side knew how to bridge that impossible gap. It took 4 hours to coax all the women out of the cave. 4 hours of patient repetition, of soldiers sitting down on the ground to appear less threatening, of more chocolate and even a canteen of water passed to the mouth of the cave. Finally, hunger and thirst won over fear. Harumi was the first to emerge, blinking in the bright sunlight like a creature from the depths. The others followed slowly, clinging to each other. They were loaded onto trucks, an act that terrified them all over again. This was it, they thought. This is when the terrible things begin. But the trucks just drove, bouncing along rough roads, past destroyed villages and abandoned defensive positions, until they reached a field hospital that had been set up near the beach. Reiko's first clear memory after leaving the cave was the tent, a large green tent with a red cross painted on the side. She knew what that symbol meant. Medical care, but medical care for prisoners? For enemy women? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Inside the tent, there were women. American nurses in clean white uniforms with red crosses on their caps. One of them smiled at Reiko, a gentle smile like you'd give a frightened animal. She held out her hand, not to grab, just offering. When Reiko didn't take it, the nurse didn't force her. She just gestured to a cot and spoke in a soft voice to someone behind her. An interpreter appeared, a Japanese-American soldier who spoke their language fluently. "No one will hurt you," he said in perfect Japanese. "These nurses need to check you for injuries and illnesses. You will be given clean clothes, food, and water. Do you understand?" The women stared at him like he was speaking an alien language, even though every word was clear. The medical examination was gentle, professional. The American nurses were efficient but kind, checking for wounds, dehydration, malnutrition. When they found lice, which all of the women had after days in the cave, they explained through the interpreter that they would need to wash their hair with a special soap. One of the comfort station workers began to weep, certain this was the beginning of the degradation they'd been warned about. But then they were led to another area, where shower stalls had been set up. Real showers with running water, hot water. Reiko stood under that spray for 10 minutes, watching the dirt and grime of weeks wash away. The water was warm, almost hot, and there was soap. Real soap that smelled like flowers. When was the last time she'd felt clean? When was the last time she'd felt human? They were given clothes. Not uniforms, not prison garb, but simple cotton dresses in various colors. Blue, green, yellow. Reiko got a green one that was slightly too big, but it was clean and soft. She ran her fingers over the fabric, unable to process this reality. They were prisoners of war. They were the enemy. Why were they being treated like this? The meal hall was another tent, larger than the medical one. Inside were long tables with benches. The women filed in slowly, still expecting a trap, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. American soldiers were there, but they weren't watching the women with predatory eyes. They were serving food. Reiko will never forget what was on that first tray. White rice, actual white rice. Not the brown military rations they'd been eating. A piece of fish, grilled with some kind of sauce. Vegetables, green beans and carrots, and a slice of bread with butter. Real butter. The portions were generous, more food than she'd seen in months. Her hands shook as she carried the tray to a table. No one ate at first. They all just stared at the food, waiting for someone to tell them it was a cruel joke, that it would be taken away, or that it was poisoned. Harumi, the oldest nurse, finally picked up her chopsticks. She'd survived this long by trusting her instincts. Her instinct now said that if they wanted to kill them, they would have done it in the cave. She took a bite of rice. The tears came immediately, rolling down her weathered cheeks. It was good rice. Properly cooked, slightly sticky, perfect. The taste of home, the taste of normalcy, the taste of life. Within seconds, all 47 women were eating. Some slowly, some frantically, many crying. The Americans watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. Fumiko, the nurse who had been shaking in the cave, ate so fast she made herself sick and had to run outside to vomit. An American medic followed her out with water and a wet cloth, helping her clean up, patting her back gently like a father would. She came back inside looking stunned, like she'd seen a ghost. "He helped me," she whispered to Reiko. "The enemy helped me." After the meal, they were served tea. Not American coffee, but actual Japanese green tea. Someone had gone to the trouble of finding tea for them. Reiko held the warm cup in both hands and felt something inside her begin to crack. It was the first fissure in the wall of propaganda and hate that had been built up over years. Just a crack, but it was there. The barracks they were taken to next were simple wooden structures with screens instead of solid walls, allowing air to flow through in the tropical heat. Inside were rows of cots, each with a pillow, 2 blankets folded at the foot, and a small trunk for personal belongings. Personal belongings. As if they had any, but in each trunk was something: a toothbrush and toothpaste, a comb, a bar of soap, a towel. Small things, but they represented an acknowledgement that the women were human beings with human needs. Reiko sat on her assigned cot and felt the mattress beneath her. It wasn't much, just canvas stretched over a frame, but it was better than the cave floor. It was better than anything she'd had in weeks. That first night, none of them could sleep. They lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the camp around them. American voices, both male and female. The rumble of generators. Distant music from a radio somewhere. The sounds of a military operation that was functioning, organized, massive. The sounds of a side that was winning. Harumi spoke into the darkness. "They are treating us according to the Geneva Convention," she said quietly. "I didn't think they would. I thought the propaganda was true." Several women made sounds of agreement. Someone else said, "But why? We are the enemy. We are Japanese. Why don't they hate us?" No one had an answer. Reiko lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about Americans, about the war, about good and evil, was being challenged by the simple act of kindness, by food and soap and blankets, by the absence of cruelty. It was more disturbing than any torture could have been, because it forced her to think, to question, to doubt. And the most frightening thing? A small part of her was grateful to be alive. Despite everything, despite the shame of capture, despite the failure of duty, she was grateful. And that gratitude felt like the deepest betrayal of all. The days developed a rhythm that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Wake at 7 a.m. to a bell. Breakfast at 7:30, the same quality as that first meal. Rice or oatmeal, fruit, bread, coffee or tea. Then morning work assignments. The women were asked, not ordered, to help with various tasks around the hospital. Folding bandages, sorting medical supplies, helping in the laundry. Light work, paid in script that could be used at the camp canteen. Reiko was assigned to work with an American nurse named Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien. Margaret was from Boston, had red hair and freckles, and smiled constantly. She treated Reiko like a colleague, not a prisoner. She showed her how the Americans organized their medical supplies, which was different from the Japanese system. She asked Reiko about her nursing training, genuinely interested. She shared pictures of her family back home, 3 brothers all in the service. It was deeply confusing. This woman's brothers might have killed Japanese soldiers, might have killed Reiko's own brother, who had died at Guadalcanal. And yet here she was, treating Reiko with respect and kindness. War was supposed to be clear, us versus them, good versus evil. But Margaret didn't seem evil. She seemed tired and far from home and trying to do her job the best she could. Lunch was at noon, dinner at 6 p.m. Between meals, there was free time. The women could read books from a small library that had been set up, books in Japanese that had been found on the island. They could write letters, though they were told the letters would be censored and might never be delivered. They could talk, rest, sit outside in the shade and watch the ocean. The ocean that separated them from home. The ocean that might as well have been an infinite void. In the second week, the mail from Japan finally caught up with the war. Letters that had been written months ago, before Saipan fell, when their families still thought they might be coming home. Reiko received one from her mother. It was written in the cramped, shaky hand of someone who was hungry. Her mother described rationing that had gotten worse, how they were eating sweet potato vines and acorn paste, how her younger sister had fainted from hunger at school, how they were saving every grain of rice, every scrap of food. Reiko read this letter while sitting at a table where she'd just finished a lunch of chicken, rice, vegetables, and fruit, where she'd eaten until she was actually full, not just no longer actively starving. The contrast was obscene. Here she was, a prisoner of war, eating better than she ever had in her life, and her family was slowly starving. She wasn't alone. All the women who received letters from home heard the same stories: starvation, bombing, cities destroyed, the Japanese government asking for final sacrifices. And here they were, the prisoners, the failures, the women who had been captured instead of dying honorably, living in relative comfort. The guilt was crushing, but it was worse than just guilt. It was cognitive dissonance of the most profound kind. They had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and death. Instead, they found 3 meals a day, medical care, and basic human dignity. They had been taught that Japan was strong, that the emperor was divine, that victory was inevitable. But the letters from home, combined with what they could see on this island, told a different story. A story of a nation losing a war it could never win. Fumiko put it into words one evening. "We are gaining weight," she said quietly. "Look at us. After 2 weeks here, we are healthier than we were serving our own country. What does that mean?" No one wanted to answer. The answer was too dangerous, too treasonous. But everyone knew it. It meant everything they'd been told was a lie. The human moments were the hardest. Like when Private James Wilson, a 19-year-old from Iowa, showed Reiko a picture of his girlfriend back home. She looked like a movie star in the black and white photo, all curled hair and bright smile. "We're getting married when I get back," he said proudly. Gonna have a farm. Raise corn and kids. He laughed at his own joke. Then he looked at Reiko and his smile faded. You got someone waiting for you? Back home? She did. She had. A young doctor she'd been engaged to. He'd been sent to Manchuria 2 years ago. She hadn't heard from him in a year. She told Wilson this in halting English, and he nodded seriously. War's hell on everybody, he said. Hope you find him safe when you get home. It was such a simple sentiment, but it broke something in her. This American soldier, who had probably killed Japanese men in battle, was expressing hope that her fiancé was safe. The mental gymnastics required to process that were exhausting. How do you hate someone who wishes the best for the people you love? There were other moments. Lieutenant O'Brien bringing Reiko aspirin when she had a headache. No questions asked. A corporal named Rodriguez teaching some of the younger women how to play poker, laughing when they caught on and started winning. A chaplain, Father Murphy, who offered to pray with them in their own tradition, even though he didn't understand the words. Small kindnesses, small recognitions of shared humanity. The canteen was another revelation. With the script they earned from working, the women could buy things. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, magazines, lipstick, actual cosmetics. After weeks of living like animals in a cave, the idea of buying lipstick was almost absurd. But some of the younger women did. They wanted to feel human again, to feel like women instead of prisoners. And the Americans running the canteen didn't mock them or deny them. They just made the sale and wished them a good day. Language became a bridge, slowly. The interpreter taught some basic phrases. Thank you, please. How are you? Simple exchanges that made daily life easier. Some of the Americans made an effort to learn Japanese phrases too. Private Wilson learned to say good morning in Japanese and said it proudly every day, even though his pronunciation was terrible. It made the women smile, which was startling in itself. When had they last smiled? But these human moments made everything more complicated. It was easier when the enemy was faceless, when Americans were just the other. But now they had names and faces and stories. Wilson wanted to be a farmer. O'Brien missed her mother's cooking. Rodriguez had a sister back home who was also a nurse. They were people. And if they were people, then what did that make the war? What did that make everything? Reiko started keeping a journal in her 3rd week of captivity. She'd found a notebook in the canteen and bought it with her script. Writing helped her process what was happening, helped her sort through the chaos in her mind. But even her private thoughts felt like treason. August 2nd, 1944. I am a disgrace. I should have died in that cave with honor. Instead, I eat American food and sleep on an American cot and work alongside American nurses. Mother would be ashamed. Father would disown me. And yet, I do not wish I was dead. Does that make me a coward? Does that make me a traitor? Or does it just make me human? August 5th, 1944. Lieutenant O'Brien asked me today about my nursing training. She seemed genuinely impressed when I described our procedures. She said I was skilled. She said she would be proud to work with me in any hospital. An American officer gave me professional respect. I should feel nothing, but I felt proud. God help me, I felt proud. What is happening to me? August 10th, 1944. The hardest part isn't the captivity, it's the kindness. If they treated us badly, if they lived up to the propaganda, I would know how to feel. I would know who I am and who they are. But every act of decency is an attack on everything I was taught to believe. Every smile is a weapon against certainty. I am losing myself, and I don't know if that's liberation or destruction. The internal conflict wasn't just Reiko's. It was collective. The women talked about it in quiet conversations, usually at night when the lights were low. They questioned everything. Had they been lied to about Americans? If they'd been lied to about that, what else was a lie? Was the emperor really divine? Was Japan really winning the war? Were they really the superior race destined to rule Asia? Every comfortable assumption was under assault. Not everyone was going through the same transformation. Some of the women, particularly the older ones, who had been more deeply indoctrinated, clung to the old beliefs. They insisted this kindness was a trick, a strategy to break their spirits. They refused to eat more than the minimum, refused to smile, refused to engage with their captors beyond what was absolutely necessary. They maintained a cold dignity that was almost admirable in its stubbornness. Harumi, the oldest nurse, led this faction. "Do not be fooled," she would say. "They are still the enemy. This comfort is designed to make us forget our duty, to make us betray our country. Remember who you are. Remember what you owe to the emperor." She said this while eating her full rations, which some of the women noted with quiet irony. Even resistance had its limits when you were hungry, but the younger women were changing faster. They had less invested in the old ways, less time spent marinating in the propaganda. They started to see the Americans not as faceless monsters, but as individual people. They learned names. They shared jokes despite the language barrier. They began to question openly in their nighttime discussions. One night, a young woman named Yuki, barely 20, said what others were thinking but afraid to voice. "If we were captured by Americans and they're treating us like this, and we were told they would torture and kill us, what else were we told that isn't true? Were we told the truth about why we're fighting? Were we told the truth about what Japan is doing in China, in Korea, in all the places we conquered?" The silence that followed was heavy, because once you start pulling that thread, the whole tapestry unravels. If the propaganda about Americans was false, then what about the propaganda about everything else? About the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere? About liberating Asia from Western colonialism? About the necessity of war? What if it was all lies? What if they had sacrificed everything for nothing? The debates grew heated sometimes. Harumi accused the younger women of being traitors, of forgetting their duties. The younger women accused the older ones of being blind, of refusing to see reality. Reiko found herself in the middle, understanding both sides, belonging fully to neither. She had been taught to be loyal to Japan, to the emperor, to the ideals of service and sacrifice. But she had also been taught that Americans were monsters, and they weren't. So what else had she been taught that was wrong? The real breakthrough came in mid-August, when the camp administration arranged for the women to watch a newsreel. It was American propaganda, they were told up front, but it showed things they needed to know. The film showed the Allied advance across Europe. It showed the fall of Germany. It showed the massive industrial capacity of America, the factories churning out planes and tanks and ships in numbers that seemed impossible. And then it showed something else. It showed how American prisoners were supposed to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. It showed the International Red Cross delivering packages. It showed the legal and moral framework that was supposed to govern warfare. The Americans weren't being kind to the Japanese women out of some strategic trick. They were being kind because that's what their own rules demanded. They actually followed those rules. Reiko thought about the Japanese camps she'd heard whispered about, the ones in the Philippines, in Burma, in Manchuria. The prisoner of war camps where Allied soldiers were worked to death, starved, beaten. The comfort stations where women from Korea and other occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery. The villages in China that were massacred. All of this had been justified, when it was acknowledged at all, as necessary for the war effort, as the cost of victory, as the natural order of things. But watching that newsreel, seeing the American perspective on how wars should be fought, how prisoners should be treated, how human dignity should be maintained even in conflict, Reiko realized something profound. The Americans had power. They were winning the war. They could do whatever they wanted to their prisoners, but they chose to follow rules. They chose to maintain their own humanity, even when dealing with their enemies. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. That was a kind of power that Japan had never understood. After the newsreel, Fumiko said it best. "They don't need to break us with cruelty. They've already won by being better than we were taught, by being better than we were." It was a devastating admission, but it rang true. The greatest weapon in the American arsenal wasn't their military might. It was their values. And those values were quietly, inexorably, changing every woman in that camp. Reiko wrote in her journal that night, I understand now why they want us dead. Not the Americans, our own commanders. They wanted us dead in that cave because they knew. They knew that if we survived, if we were captured, we would see the truth. We would see that the enemy is not what we were told. And that truth is more dangerous to the empire than any bomb. Because once you know, you can't unknow. Once you see, you can't unsee. And I have seen. God help me. I have seen. And I can never go back to what I believed before. The moment everything crystallized came on August 15th, 1944, exactly 1 month after they'd been pulled from the cave. It was a day that started like any other. Morning bell, breakfast, work assignments. But there was tension in the air. The American soldiers were talking among themselves more than usual, looking serious. Something was happening. At 2 p.m., all the Japanese women were called to assembly in the main tent. This was unusual. Reiko's heart began to race. Was this it? Was the kindness over? Were they being moved? Being sent somewhere worse? All the old fears came flooding back. The women filed in silently, faces tense, expecting the worst. But what they got was an education session. The camp commander, Colonel Stevens, stood at the front with the interpreter. He looked tired but not unkind. "Ladies," he said, waiting for the translation, "what I'm about to show you is difficult, but I believe you have the right to know the truth about the war you were fighting." What followed was a series of photographs and testimonies, evidence of Japanese war crimes, the rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the comfort women system, the medical experiments, the forced labor, image after image of atrocities committed by Japanese forces, not propaganda. Documented evidence with dates, locations, witness statements, some of it from Japanese soldiers' own photographs and diaries that had been captured. The women sat in stunned silence. Some started crying. Harumi stood up and shouted that it was lies, propaganda, fake, but her voice was shaking, because deep down she must have known. They all must have known, on some level. You don't need to tell soldiers to die before capture, unless you know that capture will reveal uncomfortable truths. Colonel Stevens continued, "I'm not showing you this to shame you personally. Most of you were nurses, teachers, workers. You didn't commit these acts, but you were part of a system that did. And I want you to understand why this war is being fought, why we can't just let your government continue. This isn't about revenge. This is about stopping something that should never have been allowed to happen." Reiko felt like she was falling. Everything she had believed, every justification she had made, every sacrifice that had seemed noble and necessary, all of it crumbled. They had told her they were liberating Asia, but these pictures showed something else. They showed conquest, brutality, a system built on cruelty and exploitation. And she had been part of it, however small her role. She had been a nurse in that system. She had helped keep that machine running. After the presentation, the women were dismissed. Most went straight to their barracks and lay on their cots in silence. Some wept. Some stared at the ceiling. Some prayed. Reiko went outside and sat under a tree, her journal in her lap, unable to write. What words could capture this? What language could express the feeling of your entire worldview shattering? Lieutenant O'Brien found her there an hour later. She sat down next to Reiko without speaking. They sat in silence for a while. Then O'Brien said quietly, "My brother was killed in the Philippines, at Bataan. I wanted to hate all Japanese people. I wanted every one of you to suffer. But then I met you, and you're just a person, just a woman who wanted to help people, who trained as a nurse to save lives. And I realized that hating you doesn't bring my brother back. It just makes me less human." Reiko turned to look at her. This American woman who had every reason to hate her, who had lost her brother to Reiko's people, was sitting beside her offering understanding. It was too much. Reiko broke down completely, sobbing like she hadn't cried since childhood. O'Brien put an arm around her shoulders and let her cry. When Reiko could finally speak, she said in halting English, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for your brother. I am so sorry for everything." O'Brien nodded. "I know you are. And that's the difference, Reiko. You're capable of being sorry. You're capable of seeing the truth and feeling remorse. That means there's hope. For you, for all of us, for what comes after this war. That night, Reiko wrote the most important entry in her journal. Today, I died. Not physically, but the person I was. The beliefs I held, the certainty I lived with, all of that died. And I don't know who I am now. I don't know what I believe. I don't know how to move forward. But I know this. I cannot go back. I cannot unknow what I now know. I cannot unsee what I have seen. The Americans didn't kill me when I begged them to. Instead, they showed me the truth. And that truth has killed everything I thought I was. Maybe that's a worse death than any bullet. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the only way to truly live. To see clearly, even when that vision breaks your heart. In the weeks that followed that devastating presentation, the women had to rebuild themselves from scratch. Some never could. Harumi became quiet, withdrawn, eating less, her eyes distant. She had invested too much in the old beliefs to survive their collapse. A few of the other older women were the same, ghosts walking through the camp, technically alive but spiritually destroyed. But others found a strange kind of freedom in the ruins of certainty. Yuki started learning English in earnest, talking with American soldiers every chance she got, hungry to understand this foreign perspective. Fumiko befriended an American nurse, and they taught each other cooking techniques from their respective cultures. Small acts of normalcy, small bridges between worlds. Reiko found herself in the middle, as always. She couldn't fully embrace the American way, but she couldn't return to her old beliefs either. She existed in a liminal space, between identities, between worlds. It was uncomfortable, but also liberating. For the first time in her life, she was thinking for herself, not just accepting what she'd been told. Talk of repatriation started in September. The war was still raging, but eventually there would be prisoner exchanges or the end of hostilities. Eventually, they would go home, and that thought filled most of the women with a complex mixture of longing and dread. They wanted to see their families again. But what would they say? How could they explain what had happened to them? What they'd learned? How they'd changed? "I'm afraid to go home," Fumiko admitted one night. "I'm afraid to see my mother and have her ask what it was like. How do I tell her that I was treated better by the enemy than by my own government? How do I tell her that the Americans fed me while she was starving? She'll think I betrayed her, betrayed Japan. And maybe I did." Several women murmured agreement. The guilt of survival had been bad enough. The guilt of enlightenment was even worse. The war ended on August 15th, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Exactly 1 year and 1 day after Reiko's moment of revelation. The news came over the radio, and the American camp erupted in celebration. The women heard the cheering, the music, the joy of men and women who could finally go home. And they sat in their barracks, quiet, processing what this meant. Japan had lost. The emperor had surrendered. Everything they had fought for, everything their nation had sacrificed, had been for nothing. Cities destroyed, millions dead. And for what? For defeat, for occupation, for the judgment of history. The older women wept. The younger ones looked stunned. Reiko felt nothing. She had done her mourning already, had already worked through the grief of lost illusions. This was just the official confirmation of what she'd known for a year. Repatriation took months to organize. In that time, the women learned more about what had happened to Japan. The atomic bombs, the fire bombings, the starvation, the occupation by American forces. The reports were grim. Tokyo was rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, simply erased. Millions were homeless, hungry, desperate. This was what they were going home to. Not the glorious empire they'd left, but ruins and shame. When the day finally came in November 1945, the women were assembled one last time. Colonel Stevens gave a speech, translated by their now familiar interpreter. "You are going home," he said, "and I won't pretend that will be easy. Your country has suffered greatly. The road to recovery will be long. But I hope that what you learned here, about how we treat prisoners, about the rules of war, about basic human dignity, I hope you'll take that home with you. I hope you'll help build a better Japan, one that values life and peace. The women were given supplies for the journey: clothes, food, toiletries, more than they needed, more than they deserved as defeated enemies. Lieutenant O'Brien hugged Reiko goodbye, both women crying. "Write to me," O'Brien said. "When mail service is restored, write to me. Let me know you're okay." Reiko promised she would, not knowing if she could keep that promise, not knowing what the future held. The ship that took them back to Japan was crowded with repatriated prisoners and civilians. Everyone had a story. Everyone had experienced trauma and loss. But the women from Saipan had something else too. They had seen the other side. They had lived with the enemy. They knew things that most Japanese people didn't know and wouldn't want to believe. When Reiko finally made it back to her family home in Tokyo, or what was left of it, her mother barely recognized her. She was healthy, well-fed, clean. Her mother was skin and bones, aged a decade in the year and a half since they'd last seen each other. The contrast was obscene. Reiko tried to explain, tried to describe what had happened, but her mother didn't want to hear it. "You survived," her mother said. "That's all that matters. The rest we'll never speak of again." But Reiko couldn't not speak of it. She became a nurse again, working in the hospitals that were overwhelmed with sick and wounded. She saw American occupation forces, and to her surprise, they continued to behave with the same basic decency she'd experienced on Saipan. They provided medical supplies, food aid, helped rebuild infrastructure. They could have been vengeful, cruel, oppressive. Instead, they helped. Just as they'd helped her. Years later, Reiko did write to Lieutenant O'Brien. The letter took months to arrive, but it arrived, and O'Brien wrote back. They maintained a correspondence for decades, these two women who had been enemies, who had become something like friends. They shared their lives across the ocean. O'Brien got married, had children, became a hospital director. Reiko also married, her fiancé having survived the war, though changed by his own experiences. She had 3 children, worked as a nursing instructor, watched Japan rebuild itself into a peaceful, prosperous nation. She told her children the story, eventually, when they were old enough to understand. She told them about the cave on Saipan, about begging to be killed, about the chocolate bar and the hot shower, and the kindness that broke her. She told them about Lieutenant O'Brien and Colonel Stevens, and Private Wilson, who wanted to be a farmer. She told them about learning that the enemy was human, and what that knowledge cost her. "Why are you telling us this?" her oldest daughter asked once. Reiko thought for a long moment before answering. "Because," she finally said, "the easiest thing in the world is to hate people you don't know. To believe that your side is good and the other side is evil. To think that war is simple, but the truth is harder and more complicated. The Americans had every reason to treat us badly. We were their enemies. We had fought against them. Our nation had committed terrible acts, but they chose to be decent anyway. They chose to follow their own rules, even when it would have been easier not to. And that taught me something more valuable than any lesson I learned in nursing school. It taught me that humanity is a choice, and that we always have that choice, no matter the circumstances." And so the chocolate bar became more than just candy. It became a symbol of the moment when everything changed, when fear met kindness and didn't know what to do, when propaganda collided with reality and shattered, when women who had been taught to die before surrender discovered that living with the truth, however painful, was its own kind of courage. The women of Saipan, those 47 nurses and workers who were pulled from a cave in July 1944, carried that lesson for the rest of their lives. Some struggled with it, some embraced it, some never fully reconciled with it, but all of them were changed by it. They had looked into the face of their enemy and seen a reflection of their own humanity. And once you see that, you can never go back to the comfortable certainty of hatred. Reiko Yamada lived to be 89 years old. She died in 2009, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In her final days, she asked for chocolate, not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to remember. To remember the scared young woman in a cave who thought her life was over. To remember the American soldier who offered her something sweet instead of something deadly. To remember that moment of impossible grace that changed everything. Her daughter found her journal after she passed away. Decades of entries, starting with those first words written in August 1944. The entries from captivity were water-stained, the paper yellowed, but the words were still clear. On the last page she had ever written in that original journal, dated November 1945 as she prepared to leave Saipan, Reiko had written, "They asked us to die. Our commanders, our culture, our duty, all of it demanded death. But the Americans gave us something harder. They gave us life and truth, and now I must figure out what to do with both. I don't know if I can ever forgive my nation for the lies. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for believing them. But I know this. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the mercy I was shown. Trying to be worthy of the second chance I was given. Trying to choose humanity when the easier path would be to choose hatred." That journal is now in a museum in Japan, part of an exhibit on the Pacific War. Thousands of people, mostly young students, file past it every year. They read those words written by a frightened nurse who discovered that the world was more complicated than she'd been taught. And maybe, just maybe, some of them take that lesson to heart. Maybe some of them remember that humanity is always a choice. That mercy is not weakness. That seeing your enemy as human doesn't make you a traitor. It makes you truly human yourself. This is the story that deserves to be remembered. Not just the battles and strategies, not just the victories and defeats, but the moments when people chose to be better than circumstances demanded. When they chose kindness over cruelty. When they chose truth over comfortable lies. These are the stories that matter, long after the wars are over. If this story moved you, if you believe these historical accounts need to be preserved and shared, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories of humanity in the midst of war, of people who chose compassion even when facing their enemies, these are the lessons we need to carry forward. Your support helps ensure that stories like Reiko's, like the 47 women of Saipan, are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to learn from what happened, and the choice is always ours.